a key skill for all sorts of change is to activate what could be called our witness or observer self. The witness is the part of ourselves that can see exactly what we do without judgment. And I like to say that it's right next door to the critic that sees the same thing and gives us holy hell sometimes. And I imagine you're familiar with that voice in your head sometimes that gets on your case. Is that any of your experience?
Oh, yeah.
No.
Oh, no. God bless you.
That's the spirit. I think this is a powerful concept to introduce to people to whom that never occurred. And you can do it in just the time it took. Simple concept. And by merely introducing the idea of a witness, that may give people just a little bit of distance from the critic. You can observe the critic rather than believing its voice and responding directly to it. When I introduce new ideas, I like to devise an experiential exercise to make that idea real as a skill in the nervous system. So the way to do that here is I'm going to ask you to each to take a moment and find some natural object. You may have to go outside, get a leaf, a flower, find an ornate bell inside, something interesting, and come back. Would you do that, please? Just take a moment and find something that you're going to pay attention to for a few minutes in a minute. Okay, we're all back. What I'd like you to do is internally decide that you're going to pay attention to your object for 4 minutes. I'll time it. And as you do that, give yourself the internal instruction. When my mind goes away, I will notice that it's gone away and bring it back. When my mind goes away, I'll notice that it's gone away and bring it back. Okay, give it a go. I'll start timing.
Okay.
Okay, let yourself come back. What was your experience?
I want to know what Margaret's looking at.
I was notice that I was experiencing, for one thing. And I totally love examining my leaf. And I saw so many things. And I love doing this kind of exercise. But I was very aware that I was doing it. So whenever I was aware I was doing it, I know I was aware I was doing it as opposed to doing it, I think. Although it seemed like a combo. You know what I mean? It was sort of, I couldn't, yeah. So.
And did you notice that at times your mind went away?
It didn't go away that often, except to be aware that I was intensely doing this. I think it went away.
Very present. That sounds good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mark, what about you?
I was having an internal argument early on in this exercise that if I had verbalized it, they would have locked me up. It started with, "This is boring," and the witness said, "No, it's not." And then it said, "This is bullshit." And then the witness said, "No, you really got to do this." So I wound up getting involved, and I'll tell you what it was. And it's a butternut squash, actually. And when I realized that, when I stayed on it, that didn't last very long. But then I realized that this is life. That my life may depend on this, and that it may be covered with chemicals. And we've really got it. And one of our projects is to get the farmers to stop using chemicals out here, because it's really important. And then I took it a step further, and I'd watched a bunch of news about Yemen today, and to realize that they don't have this in Yemen. So I was very grateful. That's how I stopped.
Mark, did you notice anything about the squash towards the end that you would not have noticed at first?
That it's been cut by hand, that it hasn't been broken off by hand, but it's been cut, and that there's no woodchuck teeth marks in it, because the animals, well, the animals do attack the vegetables, and then the farmers can't sell them because they've got marks in them. So this is a perfect, chemically treated, no woodchuck squash.
Sounds to me that you had a little trouble actually seeing the squash.
Okay.
In its immediate reality. You could see a lot about it. You could think a lot about it. You know a lot. You could see the world that goes with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just how it was for you. How about that?
It sounds like something I have to work on.
Not necessarily. That's a choice. And again, same question I had for Margaret. Did you sometimes bring your mind back to actually attending to the squash?
Sure. Yeah, 5 times.
Okay. And Arthur, how was it for you?
You're muted.
It doesn't show as muted, but I don't hear you, Arthur.
That's what he was looking at. That's right.
How can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Margaret's laughing at your flowers.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
so beautiful. Yeah.
Well, that was one of the questions I asked. Some geraniums you can eat, but not necessarily all. Which stimulated the first diversion away in thought from this thing to implications of this thing in its wider world. And, then you sort of start thinking about vegetarianism and, that type of thing. And you go, oh, hang on a minute, come back again. which I did 3 times, but it was all related thinking about this thing's place in the world. And as a systems thinker, I mean, that's not surprising to me that you will go outward often. And I'd probably trained myself to do that deliberately over a long period of time, to open all the time, rather than focus on the one object and what it is. But it was good to come back and look at it for itself consciously on, you know, whenever I was stepping out. Maybe I'm too much the other way. So that was useful.
What did you notice about the flower? Sorry.
Oh yeah, well, I was looking at the structure and the colors, and you know, as soon as you start thinking about that as a scientist, you're sort of going through the spectrum and the, you know, wavelengths of light and all sorts of things. But then you got to drag yourself back again. But yeah, you know, it's I was noticing, you know, going back to Andrew's question, never really thought about the tiny little hairs all over the plant. You know, normally noticed them a bit more this time around. I mean, I spend a fair bit of time in the garden, so you know, I'm fairly familiar with plants. But there were some aspects of it that I probably wouldn't have otherwise noticed if I wasn't really focused.
The fact that people tend to see more details makes me describe this as a creativity exercise. And I sometimes say that to see reality is a great creative act, because the reality of things is often surprisingly different than our expectation of it. But the point of the exercise, which you all did, was just to have the experience of noticing that your mind goes away and then bringing it back, because that's exercising your witness function. It's now in your repertoire of skills. It's approaching 10 o'clock. There's a whole bunch more I had thought to do, but thought we should discuss whether to round it out now and pick it up next time, or continue now, or what inclinations do you have?
How much time do you need?
I'm
Which
guessing
number
half an
one?
hour. I've never done it before.
I have another thing to go on in an hour. I would go for another 15 minutes, you know.
Okay,
15 minutes is okay.
let's give it I'll plunge in, and as we get close to 15 minutes, advise me that we're approaching that, and we'll find a natural place to pause it. If it takes that long, I imagine it'll take. Okay, let's see. Okay, I may have mentioned before a man named Richard Schwartz and something called internal family systems therapy. The story is worth recounting. Schwartz was a family therapist back in the 1980s. And he says, back then, we family therapists had a theory that if a child, say a daughter, was bulimic, it was because she was acting out the stressful dynamics of the family. If you got the family in harmony, the daughter would have no reason to have a bulimic episode. So I had a breakthrough session with the family, and I thought, that's great. And then to my astonishment that week, the daughter went out and had another binging episode. So I did something that we family therapists never did. I began to ask her about her internal life. Hey, what was going on just before you binged? And he said his patients all reported that they had some conflicting voices going on in their heads, which actually is a bit like what Mark described. Hey, this voice is saying this, and this one's saying this. And Schwartz says, I thought that was a bit weird until after a while I noticed that I have the same thing going on in my head. So, cut ahead. What they did was he worked out that it's possible to talk with these voices. They act as actual personalities within us. And that's the framework they bring, that we're all made up of parts or personalities. In principle, all the personalities want to help us, but some are injured and have what they call burdens, qualities of hurt or rage or even indoctrination. But you can communicate with them by directly talking with them, either internally or an external therapist or colleague can talk to them as well. And I've done that myself as a therapist. And when the parts get resolved enough, or even when they're simply asked to move aside, what comes to the fore is something wonderful, which Schwartz calls, and the internal family therapists call, our core self, which has qualities of caring, compassion, creativity, courage, calmness. And they say the core self is never injured. It's never injured because under extremely traumatic situations, the other parts of the self actually protect it. But when it emerges, it's actually wise and competent, so it doesn't have to be trained. And indeed, Schwartz in his therapy tries to bring it to the fore as quickly as possible, because our wise core self can play a role in our own healing. So I mentioned the Critic. I came across a little cartoon.
That's good.
And the idea is that we're all made up of different kinds of parts. Among my parts is my creative part, my playful part, my world-saving part, my intellectual part, my lazy part, which is important because I can use downtime. And then, of course, all of us would have historically have had some injured parts as well. So we're made up of many parts. And that's just how things are from their point of view. It's normal. I already described this. But it gets a bit deeper. If we have injured parts that are, let's say, angry, then there could be a part that suppresses the anger in order to keep things on even keel externally. They call that a protector part. And sometimes, though, that pained or angry part will thrust its way into consciousness anyway. And in that case, sometimes another kind of part appears, which they call a distractor. I think that's what they call it. For example, sometimes there are kids who cut themselves with knives or razors or something. They do that not to commit suicide, but to create pain. And the purpose of that pain is to distract them, apparently. Inquiry shows this, it's not theory, to distract them from the deeper, really pain part that's too horrible to deal with, or so they imagine. And again, when these different parts either are healed or partly healed and move aside, then the core self can come to the fore. Now, I want to shift and make an analog. I found it a fascinating story to read about the discovery of Pluto. In the 1800s, astronomers were tracking the path of Neptune, and they thought they had it pretty well figured out. They could predict where it would go mathematically, except sometimes it didn't. There was a slight variation. So they surmised that there was something beyond Pluto, beyond Neptune, that was causing the variation. And in the 1911 or something, an astronomer figured that out, pointed his telescope into the depths of space where he thought this object might be, and voila, hooray, Pluto. So this is an analogy for how we can detect something about our unconscious, something unconscious going on in us or in other people. I want to tell this story to illustrate the process. I was in a spiritual community in Washington, D.C. that was very psychologically oriented. It was called The Path. And we had I think we call it our political group or something like that. But really what the group was about was we would meet occasionally to explore the relationship between the external worldly events we were fired up about and our inner dynamics, including our unhealed psychological dynamics. So in this particular session, we're having the usual check-in, and Jane, who was a lawyer, says, I have a project going on to pass a law to have more rights for injured children, kids who've been abused. And one of our members said, Jane, sounds to me like you've got a forcing current a bit in that. And the path of forcing current was a quality of insistence that we thought was often a sign, or maybe always, but certainly often a sign of some unresolved, deeper issue driving whatever we're doing. So the question was, Jane, would you be willing to explore this? That was the point of the group. So of course she said yes. And so somebody in the group took over the lead in facilitating, began to explore some of her past experiences. They went here, they went there, and finally up came a memory of a time when she was about 4 when she was slapped. And sharp as a tack, somebody said, Jane, that's child abuse. And the penny dropped. What she was trying to do with her legal initiative in the present is to make the world safe for her inner child of the past, which of course would be impossible. Now, recognizing that didn't in any way invalidate the legal project she was working on in the present. It just meant that she could relax about the child part, relax about the insistence, and get on with competently doing this actually really worthwhile project. So the pattern is we have ordinary consciousness, just life is going on. And then something comes into consciousness, some anomaly that's an indication that there's something deeper that's unconscious. That indication could be anxiety, or could be somebody says something and we get suddenly upset. We don't quite know why. So among possible indicators are also rage or depression, kinds of compulsions, the real drive to control others. I'm sure we could expand the list. In our community, in the path, it was our custom to, if we thought somebody had something, quote, off, some unconscious driver, to gently bring it to their attention. The question is, how do we respond to that? And the advice that we were given, which I think is wise, was to consider what truth, if any, might be in the confrontation. And then it's up to us to decide what we do with whatever we see going on. one of the techniques I learned from Gene Houston actually, for dealing with these somewhat unknown disturbed parts is called the St. Francis process. And the story goes like this. When Francis was on his way to becoming a saint, he was on his horse outside of Assisi, riding on a country road, and his horse stopped in front of a leper. And it was clear that Francis had to deal with this leper. And as he apparently told the story, he got off his horse, or got off his high horse, as Jean described it, and embraced the leopard, and indeed kissed it, and said, "Ah, dolce, dolce, such sweetness," when he did so. And Jean said, "All right, everybody, maybe this is a way we can all deal with our own phobias. So think of a phobia, get on the floor, imagine you're on a horse, begin to rock, imagine you're on a country road, and up ahead is going to be a shadowy figure that represents your phobia." So I picked something fairly innocuous, felt a little shift. And then after the workshop, I went home, got in my rocking chair and said, okay, I want to meet the part of me that is afraid of men. Now, I was in my 50s at the time. And indeed, reasons I didn't know, though I could surmise, I was afraid of men. So I do the drill, get on the horse, and get rocking, and then a bit the visualization appears, and I can see the figure up ahead. I approach it, and it's a tall, gaunt, adolescent figure. And as instructed by Jean, I look into its eyes, and I see pain there. And then I shift perspectives and imagine me looking up at me on the horse. And the me on the horse got off and embraced the me standing there. And I burst out in tears. And that was the end of my fear of men. 20 minutes work at most, no analysis, life went on. I went on to do the St. Francis process with many other issues. It often took me to very young places, and I invented in my imagination healing rituals. And then after a while, I pretty much stopped doing it because stuff wasn't coming up. And the payoff I got from doing this and other kinds of work was that about a decade ago, I noticed that I was having times of uncaused joy. Not that I was perfect, but a lot of stuff had worked out. So a bit more of my core self was coming through, I think. In design shops, and this begins to relate to the conversation we had at the beginning today, the custom is when you get to the design process, you just decide, okay, this is the new direction we're going to take. Now, how do we make it work? So they split into subgroups and work on pieces of how to make it work, come back to main group, share the work they've done, and that work is to be criticized in a constructive way, to be critiqued. Oh, what about this? Not sure about that. Did you think of this? Here's another idea. Back to the drawing board, another iteration, and then they bring it all together and walk away with a well thought through project that they're committed to making happen. So to critique it is critical to the process. And I think it's critical to social change as well. And one of the things I like about this is, yes, an elegant way of doing some of that, this progressive movement. I think it's the same pattern. Don't defend, but just think what merit, if any, might be in the critique somebody just raised. Maybe it's complete bullshit, but maybe it's spot on. Maybe it's some mixture, as Arthur commented earlier. So we take it on board. Now, bringing back to internal family systems theory, it may be that we have a really strong reaction when we're criticized, and we're back to this again. That reaction is a break from the smoothness of ordinary consciousness, so to speak. And it can indicate something powerful underneath. I've observed a forcing current. Indeed, some people do what I call the tail wagging the dog. I've seen other people, it seems to me, I'm trying to have a focused conversation and get to the reality of catalyzing a movement, as I always do. And I find really smart, intelligent people avoiding getting to the main point, which is different than accepting what I'm saying, understanding it, and then saying, here's why I don't do it, or I won't buy it, or something. But actually just mentally not getting it. So something's going on down there, it seems to me, at times.
It's 7:16.
And we're
I think-
almost done. We're almost done. This is good. Bottom line is, we would do well, all of us, if we notice stuff to come up, to occasionally take time to sort it out. I often find myself, I don't want to do that, and then I do it, and I get the payoff. And my book, Inner Work, is a manual for that, and it's freely available to download from my own website and from the Inspiring Transition website.